Okay, folks. Last couple of laps now. I've just met this chap for the first time today. The last time, every time I see him, it's the same with Susan Crowns, their commission members, that's coaches commission members, and normally I see them on the screen. So it's so refreshing to see you in real life that you actually really exist. You know, you could be pretending at the other end. Okay, so Erin Gadson. Thank you very much indeed for being a former collegiate athlete yourself in triple jump. Pretty good performances, I understand.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the joke is now, you know, we're gonna talk about Thea a lot more later, but she jumps farther than me now, so that tells you how good of an athlete I was.
Okay, but you were at collegiate national, regional national level.
Yeah,
kind of stuff. But I guess really, what I always felt about in my own coaching is, can we make the athlete a student of their event? And I guess you've grown as a student of the event before you moved on to the next stage of being what for over 10 years now is a coach, and certainly 10 years working with Thea. So how did it all start?
So I think my coaching journey kind of started as you know, my collegiate career was a little bit frustrating. I had a couple guys that I trained with who were NCAA champions, and I felt like, you know, I should be as good as them. And, you know, obviously I was naive. There's a lot of things I was missing through that. So through that process, you know, I started reading and learning and taking coaching classes and things like that just to get myself better. And I was coaching some high school kids in exchange for use of facilities and things like that. And those high school like youth athletes got better and better, you know, some state champions, some All-Americans, things like that. And then, you know, Thea happened to be in the area, and one of the guys that told you was NCAA champion and also an Olympian for the US Virgin Islands. You know, he kind of connected us. I started coaching her, and then, you know, she went in 6 months, she went from jumping 1360 to 1420, qualified for the World Championships in London. And so, you know, every year we just got better and better and better, and, you know, turned into Olympic champion.
Okay, so I can see somebody sort of landing straight into something, but I'm going to show you my ignorance from way back as a coach. If I had a long jumper who was struggling, I thought, oh, let's try the triple jump instead. Is there a connection?
I don't know. I mean, I think at the youth level, you should try everything. You should try long triples, girls. I mean, I think there's a lot of good. I think a lot of European countries in particular kind of do the more the decathlon, heptathlon kind of method. When you're younger, you try everything and then see what sticks. I don't think that, you know, your failed long jumper should turn into triple jump. Like triple jump requires, you know, a lot of, you know, other qualities. So, you know, maybe you don't have to be as fast as a jump, maybe, but you definitely got to be a lot stronger and probably more coordinated.
That's a good point. I'll come to the details of that in a second. But you mentioned this idea of doing multiple activities before you specialize. And I'd like to linger on that just from your own personal philosophy's point of view. We do a lot of work with guys like we've got colleagues from Germany who've done a lot of work on looking at those athletes who prevail after being great as juniors and those who don't. And oddly enough, those athletes who've started off and actually stayed late doing different sports, not just combined events, but doing different sports, they are more likely to be successful as senior athletes than those athletes who specialized from early on in their teens.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think there's a lot of research and talking about long-term development, you know, where kids should be trying to do stuff, be as diverse in their kind of training as they can for as long as they can. And then, you know, when they get toward, you know, post-puberty, you know, maybe, you know, 16 to 18, they can start, you know, specializing. I think it's really just like, I think there's twofold. There's a mental component and there's also like a physical and physiological component to it, right? And so, you know, I think that, you know, if you're doing something at the junior or youth or junior level at a really high level, like, you know, a world medalist or something at that age, I think that's gonna be like really stressful. There's gonna be lots and lots of pressure. If you think of someone like, you know, Yeah, like I don't know him personally, so I'm not gonna, speculate too much upon him, but it's like, that's a ton of pressure to be that young and be that good. And I think a lot of kids can't really, get over that hump of all that expectation, all that pressure. You see it happen, I think, in British athletics a lot. Obviously it's really good to be excited about, young stars and what they can do, but I think psychologically that's really, really tough. So I said all that to say, I think that, if you kind of, from a more physiological and physical standpoint, if you're more diverse, you built a lot of different correlations, you built a lot of different skills, you built a lot of different, physical strengths and things like that. Maybe you're not going to be a world junior champion. I think that's fine, but then your progression is a little bit, maybe I wouldn't call it delayed, but the time horizon is a little bit longer. The progression is a little bit, longer. But I think mentally it's a lot easier to do that. It's less stressful. And I also think that longer term, you're going to have more skills that are going to allow you to be successful instead of kind of just like, I think it's happening in the United States, for example, where there's a lot of high school kids training like professional athletes. So then, by the time you're, 22, you've already done everything. How do you get better?
That's a really, really good point. Arnie Gulish, the guy I was trying to remember, who's done a lot of research on this stuff. And what we're trying to work out is it the coach? Is it the parents? Is it the member federation who are putting too much of a load on, let's at least get a world title as a junior? And by that, in doing so, in my simple language, you squeezed all the juice out of the orange. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you said it better than I did. I just don't. Again, I think it's fun. I actually love watching under 18s and under 20s. I think those competitions are really fun. There's like a lot of excitement. The kids are really emotional, excited. There's a lot of PBs, a lot of unexpected things happen. So compared to the senior, I think it's going to be really fun to watch. But honestly, I mean, respectfully, like world junior champion it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't do anything for. It doesn't. I think honestly, it's a pretty bad predictor of like senior performance. There's been a lot of studies on that. I think like only 10% of like senior champions were like junior medalists or something like that. So
you're right. 6% of the medalists at the World Junior Championships go on to be medalists at the senior. Pretty devastating bit of attrition, folks.
Yeah, so again, I think part of that is mental, and part of it I think is, as you said, you kind of squeeze out the juice out of them already.
And you think you've arrived. But that, to me, that's one of the big things. I've got a couple of colleagues at the back here. When I was a chief coach in the UK, I had to do a presentation in Mainz to Germany. And they were talking about the future, because my big ambition as a chief coach was to knock Germany out of the territory, because they always beat us. But I was determined that wasn't going to happen in the long term. And the guy who interviewed me on television said, "So what do you think's wrong?" I said, "Well, I tell you what, I think it's wrong to give an athlete a Mercedes for getting a world junior title. Because you think you've arrived, you've got it. I mean, what your ambition is to get these kind of things, and if you're given them at that point, where's your future after that?"
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It made me think of some other examples of, some folks I've coached and some things I've seen. I just think like what can happen is if someone has been like anointed as the chosen one at a young age, they're going to be a lot less. Well, I think that in some cases they're a lot less coachable, but I think they're a lot less likely to take risks and a lot less likely to try stuff. I just don't think at the age of 20 years old, you don't even fully know yourself yet. Like you don't know yourself mentally yet. You don't know what training works yet. You know what training got you where you are now, but that training might not get you to the next level. So if you think that you've already got it, you already understand, you already know everything, then how the heck are you going to get better and get to the next level? There's usually a huge gap between the junior level and the senior level. And so you have to be humble enough to continue to improve. And I think that's what happens with a lot of folks is they're not, they think they already know what they're doing, and that year over year, they're just going to continue to get better by just showing up at practice. That doesn't happen, I think, really at the senior level when people are getting medals.
Okay, well, just lingering with this idea of going from junior to senior, I don't know if we're aware of it in this room, but the most successful nation in the world at transferring from junior to senior is France. In almost every sport, by the way, in almost every sport, they've got a program there that keeps them retained. And I think one of the reasons for that was that they were the first nation in the world to create a competition called Les Espoirs, the under-23s. And I think there was a reason for them to stay in the sport once they got past the juniors without suddenly being dropped into the seniors and getting your backside kicked, because they weren't accustomed to that as juniors. And one of the big advantages, by the way, of juniors who've had to be second or third or fourth is they've probably not been endowed with the same amount of talent as the people who are getting firsts as juniors. They've certainly not been squeezed as hard. The fact is that these kids lose, but they win more often than they lose. And they develop a quality in their growing years called resilience. They learn how to bounce back, that it doesn't always go right. And so one of the tricks I tried with in my period with UK athletics was that anybody who got a European junior title was obliged, in cooperation with an arch enemy called Andy Norman, to make sure that they competed in senior competition when they were juniors, to feel what it's like to have to bounce back. And I think that I'm just wondering, I don't know if your views, and Sue's, but I did mention this in one of our meetings, is should we be asking World Athletics to consider under-23 championships instead of juniors?
I mean, I think, well, I don't know if that's the either or, but I think under-23 is fun. I mean, I think Europe does a lot of under-23 stuff. So North and South America aren't great about those competitions. Yeah, I definitely think, like I said, there could be a big gap between, juniors and seniors. And I think you also see that with the NCAA system. It's like you can be an NCAA champion, if we're talking, say, women's triple jump, you win, you jump 14 meters, but 14 meters isn't going to do anything at the senior level. So you still might need another 2 or 3 years to really actually become a legitimate professional at the senior level. And if you don't have that support, you're just going to fall out of the sport. And I think a lot of athletes fall out of the sport because, they can't really monetize their success yet at the senior level. And then a lot of federations aren't supporting them because they're not medal contenders yet. So I do think that there definitely needs to be something that bridges that gap.
Yeah, and Europe actually have worked on that, and I'm really pleased that they have done. And whether it's an either or is irrelevant. I think at some point we should look at helping people to have a reason for going through these. And I guess they're difficult years, aren't they, folks? From junior to senior. Some kids are at universities. It's a life-changing part of your career. And I think somehow or other we've got to work out. And I'm not sure if it's a physiological thing. I'm not sure if it's psycho. I don't know what the basis of it is. Can we find a way of helping them go through that journey, which is, as I say, difficult, life-changing one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they say that mentally folks aren't really fully developed until, 25, right? And so I think there's just a lot of changes that are going on in a young person's life, 21, 23. And so, again, there's just a lot of support that's needed. And I think especially nowadays, social media and things like that, it's even, I think, harder for those younger athletes to kind of make that transition, again, with all those pressures and things like that. So, I think it's even now more than ever that it's probably important. So the reason for this part of the conversation was to help people in the audience know who you are and how you think about track and field. But let's get specific now. We've got a kid here who's cooking a long jump 664 and 1525 and get an Olympic gold medal. Tell us a story about the journey. The story about the journey. So I think I mentioned to you all, her story is kind of that, literally in the Rio Olympics 2016, where she literally got last place. And so for some of you folks, like, she was there because of universality. Dominica, 70,000 people, you can bring one male and one female to the Olympics, and she was their best female, and she got to go, and she got last, literally. And then she was looking for a new coach. She came to me, and we, 6 months we got it actually to legitimately hit the qualifying standard to go to the London World Championships, and again, I think the rest is history. Yeah. But I think really the key with her is that she actually was really more of a high jumper and a multi-event. She did the pentathlon and high jump mainly is what she did, and she did triple jump a little bit. And so I think kind of going back to what we were talking about before with, kind of not specializing too early and being, really diverse, allowed her to continue to improve. And she also just wasn't someone who was just a world beater. Obviously she had talent, right? But she wasn't winning everything at a young age. And I think the reason why she's been able to progress kind of year over year is just, she's always trying to find a way to get better. Even this year, she jumped 15.25s, top 10 all time, which is awesome. But we're still trying to get better at practice, and I'm still, pushing her, and we're never resting on our laurels.
I see. So I understand from the conversations we've had over time that really you're a big technique focused person. Talk us through the importance of getting the technique right before you think about a conditioning squat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is my philosophy and kind of what I see in the triple jump. I think sometimes maybe people do it backwards, which is like, let's get the person faster and stronger and more elastic or quicker off the ground. Like all those things are important, right? But I think ultimately, like, your technique has to be good, or you're not really going to survive good then, or you're going to be, giving up a lot of, potential for improvement. And so for me, I'm always like, from say like maybe week 3 of training, like we're working on technique, running technique, jumping technique. I've said this before, I've said this to Thea, said this to a bunch of other people, like Thea is definitely not the most talented triple jumper in the world. Yeah, she's a world indoor champion, she's an Olympic champion, she's top 10 all time. But I think she's that because, she works really hard and she has a pretty darn good technique. And so I think that that's really where, like, I think that's really where there's a ton of value. So if you really understand the event really well and work on the technique, you can get more reps in because you're going to be healthier and learn more. Like, again, I think of it almost like, I use this analogy a lot. I think about it like gymnastics. Like if you're doing gymnastics, right, like you have to practice the technique. You don't just like full send and try to do like a flip or something. Because if you mess it up, you're gonna land on your head and get paralyzed and you're gonna be in trouble. Right. And so if you think about triple jump like that, you should have the same type of the same type of intensity about your technique for triple jump. Because if you don't do it right, eventually those joints are gonna fail you. And it's also, you can't run away from physics. If your posture is off, it's going to change your center of mass. It's going to change the force vectors, and all that type of stuff is going to lead to you not jumping as far, and you adding extra stress to your joints that you don't need.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I've always been pretty obsessive about is that if your basic skill has got a flaw, and you try to get faster and stronger, you're just getting faster and stronger doing the wrong thing. So you're practicing the wrong thing more regularly. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk to you now about technique in, what do you think are the core things in triple jump that has to be in place and are non-negotiables in establishing technique?
So again, I mentioned posture earlier, and so I think when triple jump is really about how well can you kind of receive ground contacts and then get off the ground reasonably quickly. And so you need to have obviously a lot of eccentric strength, so your ability to kind of withstand those forces. You also need to have a lot of kind of muscle and tendon stiffness. So these are things that you just can create from isometrics, heavy lifting, different type of plyometrics. But then as far as the actual like technical component, like you need to have good posture because again, if your posture, if your anteriorly rotates, like your chest is forward, your head is down, that means that, you know, your contact, you're probably gonna land on the forefront of your foot as opposed to more of a kind of a forward contact. So if you do that, then that means all that force is gonna get put into your, you know, your calf and your tibia and stuff like that, as opposed to being put into your whole leg, right? You wanna be able to recruit as many muscles as possible in that contact because, you know, the forces could be, you know, up to, you know, 20 times your body weight, right? So you have to have good posture, you gotta have active contacts. So active contacts is really, you know, pre-tensioning the legs, swinging them down aggressively to the ground. And so I think with those two things, those are probably the most important pieces. Obviously, you know, speed helps, but if the technique is not there, then the speed is actually going to make the event harder.
That's a really good point, because I think something I've always had in mind is that in the technical events, you've got to have a sense of concept about what this means. And so way back in time, when I was trying to teach people about triple jump, I always said the first step off the board is the last stride of the approach. And then when you take that a little bit further, and you look at somebody like Jonathan Lewis, he persisted in, when a lot of people were trying to go into double arm shifts throughout, he persisted with single arm, because if you look at his jumps on that fantastic day, it was all about speed. Right? He did not want to lose the vertical. He wanted the horizontal to be really moving over the first two steps, so that actually the only jump was the last one. Now, I hope I'm not talking in circles here, but is that a kind of concept that we try to fit into our athletes?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I love Jonathan Edwards. I have not met him yet. That's the one guy I have not met. I think obviously the best technique, you know, obviously world record and all that stuff. You can't say enough great things about what he did. I don't think everybody can do what he did. So, you know, the qualities that one, it took him a long time to get there. He was on the older side, you know, when he was breaking those records. But two, I mean, you know, if you believe the data, you know, he was one of the fastest people on the runway, period, including long jump.
Yeah, just to give you a background on that.
Carl as well.
Give you a background on that. He medaled in the 60 meters indoors, the British Championships. Yeah. So he was that fast. Yeah.
Right. So he's super fast. And I think one of the hardest things I think everybody can get faster, but you know, I think when we talk about, I don't actually love to talk about genetics, but like, I think getting to be super duper fast can be really difficult, right? And so like, I don't know if everyone could get as fast as Jonathan Edwards. But then you look on the other side of the spectrum of like, you know, Cubans, for example. Cuba has had tons and tons of success, maybe not quite at the senior medal level, not as much as you think. Like if you look at the kind of the junior stuff and the youth stuff, Cuba is like insane. If you looked at the last Olympics, you know, while 3 different countries got medals in the men's triple jump, they were all Cubans because they, you know, defected and things like that. And so those the Cuban guys, you know, they're real all about power. They're actually not particularly fast. They're all about rhythmic, big slow phases. And they can jump 18 meters. They haven't jumped, you know, 18:29 world record. And I think what they need to do that is get a little bit more speed. But I do think there's different ways to do it. You know, Christian Taylor was also kind of more of like Jonathan Edwards style, where the first 2 phases had a ton of speed and a really big last phase. And so, you know, arguably, you know, the 2 best distances were kind of with that jump dominated technique. You know, from some of the computer simulations, I think hop dominated could work, but it's really hard to be hop dominated if you're not really strong. And I think the Cubans are able to do that because they have a system where it's kind of survival of the fittest. They're gonna just like jump you forever, and whoever makes it through and survives is gonna be really, really good. I don't necessarily think it has to be that way, but again, the only way to do kind of hop dominated big phase is you have to be super, super strong. And I think a lot of the gym training has kind of shifted away from being able to handle those big eccentric forces by doing, you know, a lot of the stuff I was talking about earlier with kind of tendon and joint stiffness, where you really have to do tons of isometrics, tons of really heavy, slow stuff. People move to more of the faster, quick stuff in the weight room, which is great for, maybe, being very elastic, getting off the ground quickly, but you still need to be able to handle really, really high forces.
That's a good point. Just before we leave the technique stuff, one of the arguments, I don't know how many you've been working triple jump at any point, one of the arguments about not using double arm shift is it contributes far more to the vertical than to the horizontal. And the more vertical you have, the more shock when you hit the floor in the first two jumps. And that can be a bit debilitating technique.
Yeah, so, Thea is one of the only women in the world, certainly the only woman in the world in the top 10 that double arms. She was kind of like, you asked me, a pioneer of women double arming. And, I think it's old kind of sexist stuff where women are just weak and they can't, do double arm and stuff like that. So I think that there should be maybe a little bit more balance in the sense of, I think a lot of, say, average woman triple jump is like, just run as fast as you can and just like save it all for the last phase. I think we need the women, if you look at phase ratios, women's middle phase is like really bad from a phase ratio standpoint, 25 to 27% is like, that's not good. It should be around 30% if you ask me. And so I think that, yeah, for sure. The trade-off is, double arm is gonna probably have more of a vertical component, and that means that you're losing some horizontal component, but I also think that it depends on the person, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that the Cuban folks, the way they jump, they don't necessarily have that same ability to maintain the horizontal velocity as much. So I don't think everybody necessarily should jump that way, but yeah, I just think that's the crux of triple jump. How much horizontal are you willing to give up for vertical? And that's going to depend on what your qualities are as far as your strength, sensor strength, your elasticity, in your speed.
I guess that's horses for courses, and one of the things we were talking about earlier is that John Turiak saying to me, every technique is a compensation. So each athlete has their own compensation, and so on. Women in triple jump. One of the reasons, I guess, historically, why people were not comfortable at pushing women in that direction was because of the angle of Vegas from the wider hip, the different force that would be exerted on the knees. Has that concern evaporated altogether? And does it actually impact on conditioning itself ultimately?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't think the Q angle, so like, the angle of the hip.
Yeah.
I think it does impact. Like if you look at the really elite triple jumpers, most of them have pretty narrow hips. So not to say that if you have wider hips, you can't. I mean, I think one example I can think of, like Nicola from Finland, she jumped 1460 something. She's very tall, but she has some pretty wide hips and she did well. So I don't think it's necessarily inhibits you from doing well. But I mean, I think there's research, for example, like for football, soccer, where young women in particular have a much higher incidence of like ACL tears, particularly because I think of that knee valgus and the Q angle and stuff like that, and they tend to be just more underdeveloped from a strength standpoint. So, said all that to say, I think that yes, women with wider hips probably need to do more, stability work and make sure that their connective tissue is really, really strong. Is it a detractor from being a good triple jumper? Not necessarily, but you just have to make consideration. The way I kind of coach is like, you are how you are, and you got to do the best you can with what you got. And so I look at the person and say, hey, what do I think? What are they good at? Where are their weaknesses? Where are their liabilities that they have to get better at? And we work around them, and people work hard, and we incrementally get better and better, and later on those improvements. You never know what people can do.
Yes. But a really good point, and I think lingering with the ACL problem in female in contact sports and so on. One of the arguments at the moment, we were speaking earlier about before coaching, how we prepare people for disciplines. I think there's quite a lot of work now being done on making sure that the athletes, actually male and female athletes, do a lot of lateral movements in plyometrics and so on, in addition to the forward and backward movements, to prepare the joint, the knee joint, for the thrusts that are going to be in there. And I understand that Dean Benton, don't know if anybody knows Dean Benton in Australia, he's been doing quite a bit of work on this, and he feels that they can actually reduce the incidence of ACLs by that kind of work. And so now we're going to move on to conditioning. And I've just noticed, you can't see it from out there, folks, but this guy's got a remarkably long scar that starts above his knee and finishes below it. And I'm reckoning that's either going to be ACL or a partial replacement or a meniscus.
So I do have a torn meniscus. It was not repaired, but the repair here is a torn quadricep tendon. So, as I kind of joked earlier, I was kind of a mediocre collegiate athlete, but I was actually super strong. So I could, squat over 500 pounds, for example. So that's huge. I'm a shell of my former self. I could clean, maybe 315, I could front squat 4 or 5. I was very, very strong. Compared to where I am right now, I was almost 20 pounds heavier than I am now. Probably just muscle. And so, I used to triple jump. I had really poor mobility. My technique wasn't as good as I thought it was. And eventually, this is from a step contact. Did a hop phase, it stepped, and this tendon right here, this whole tendon just snapped. And so, it took me probably a year and a half to get all my strength all the way back. But stopped jumping after that. So I guess I'm a good coach.
I guess this comes back to making sure that the technique's right in the first place, huh?
For sure, yeah, and I think that's kind of why I have such an emphasis on it, because I don't want someone to have to go through what I did. It's a pretty traumatic injury. But I think it can be prevented if you I'm gonna say prevent. The likelihood can be reduced a fair amount if you kind of know what you're doing. I don't think you can ever totally prevent injuries, but I think, if you do things well, if you have good preparation, the randomness goes down a lot. But I think a lot of times, when people get hurt, a lot of injuries I think are largely predictable. You're like, you keep running like that, you're gonna tear your hamstring. Eventually happen. You keep jumping like that with your chest forward and just sticking your foot out and not active. Yeah, you're gonna tear up your ankle, your knee, or your hip. Something's gotta give.
Okay, so this morning we were treated by Matt Horsnell was talking about and Nicola Olyslagers training, and he does an awful lot of work on sand, soft surfaces. Has that ever featured in part of your program?
No, obviously we jump in the sand all the time, but but I think what you're alluding to is, people do a lot of barefoot stuff in the sand, build up kind of foot muscles and more stability stuff. Honestly, I think that stuff is probably good. What I've noticed is something that's, I don't know, it's interesting. I haven't fully developed my theory on this, but I think a lot of the really good jumpers have really good stiffness because their feet are flat, and that flatness kind of helps you get to a stiffer position faster. And you mentioned knee valgus earlier. If you look at, for example, actually, if you triple jump, you should go watch Guillermo Rojas and look at it in slow motion. You'll see there's a lot of valgus in their knee, and you also see this in basketball a lot when people, before they go up to jump, their knees go in. I think the reason why that happens is because it allows you to create a ton of stiffness really fast. I don't think it's necessarily the best for your joints, but it's a very stiff position, and it's a lot easier to do than just a traditional, just bending of your knee and without it going in. And so it's really stiff, and it's really fast, and allows you to get off the ground really quickly. So again, I said that aside because I think that the sand stuff is really good because it allows you to work on your arch strength and stuff like that. But I actually think a lot of the good jumpers have flat feet and they don't even really use that or need that. Not to say it couldn't be useful, but I think a lot of it, I don't know. I don't think it's necessary. I don't use it.
Okay, it was just that one of the fascinating things about his program was that Nicole, out of 16 years, has only had 1 year where there's been an injury. And that he was putting a lot of that down to the compensations that take place when you're moving around on sand, and you have all the small muscles are having to make this or that kind of adjustment, and that kind of protects when the bigger guys come in. It protects the joints.
So I actually agree with that point 100%. So like, for example, let's say you twisted your ankle and you did bad rehab on it, so now your ankle is really stiff. So if your ankle is really stiff and you don't have the ability, to dorsiflex as well, then that means that when you strike the ground, your knee is going to have to withstand more of those forces.
Yep.
Right. And so I think what the sand work does is it allows you to, you're going to hit a lot of deeper angles in a safer way, kind of build up that strength in kind of deep ranges of motion, which I do think is important. There's other ways I think to do that. And I think as a good coach, you can start like identifying like, hey, are there restrictions in these sections? And then does that have a chain reaction of where you're putting extra force in some, in some joint that's farther up the chain? And like that can create a lot of issues. Like even basic stuff like, I had this little kind of like wobble board thing and I was just kind of messing around with it. And I was doing that and I was getting a lot more, range of motion in my foot. And then I did squats and I was like, oh, these squats are nice. Like these feel like butter. These are good. So it's like you doing some of the stuff in your ankle is going to allow you to do more stuff in your knee. And you're going to be just way more efficient. You didn't get stronger in your knee, you just able to hit the positions better than much more efficient positions. And so it is really important to do those things, say, potentially with your ankle and with your feet, if it allows the stuff up in your knee and your hip to do what they need to do and be efficient.
That's a really good point. And you mentioned feet there, and there wasn't enough time to squeeze this into the program here, folks. But if you go on to World Athletics e-learning website, we've got a really good presentation on there from a guy from South Africa talking about the feet and how we're actually causing problems in the future if we don't deal with the health of the feet much earlier. You know what the foot's like. They call it the plantar vault, right? It's a vault because it's got an arch this way. If you put the 2 feet together, you've got an arch that way and so on. And so that vault, the integrity of that vault is really important. And if people are wearing daft shoes from very early on in life, and they don't exercise their feet, that vault collapses a little bit. And as it collapses, you lose part of the power in the feet. And part of the power, part of doing that ends up coming from the other end also and putting different pressures on the knee. So I advise you all, if you've got time to do so, please go into World Athletics e-learning website. It's a very good piece, about an hour. But I promise you, when you come out the other end, you'll have a whole bunch of exercises that you can be put into your athletes to help them. But coming back to your compensation side, that we don't need to sand, if you like, if we've got a background of multiple events and multiple coordinations in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like, particularly in track and field, right, or athletics, if you specialize early, your training is going to be potentially very like linear, for example. And so I think that, doing kind of multiple sports or being more of a combined event athlete, you're getting rotational things, you're getting some lateral things. You're just kind of able to hit a lot of, different positions that you wouldn't get if you, let's just say you were a pure sprinter or, mid-distance or distances. So you're just running straight, pretty much all your training is just, in like the sagittal plane, right? And so I think that, like I said, doing those other movements are going to give you some movement diversity that's going to actually help you be healthier in the future.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. And before my last couple of questions. First of all, what's the toughest session that she does?
Toughest session? That's a good question. Well, let me say this. Maybe this might be a little, probably different, maybe controversial. She's never, in the last, let's say, 8 years, hasn't run more than 60 meters at a time. And so, I know that's probably a lot different than what some folks do, but I mean, you know, on the runway, she's running 40 meters. And so, you know, our facility is wall to wall, like 45 meters. And that's where we train all the time. And, you know, if you look at the data, she's one of the fastest jumpers in the world. And, you know, obviously she has all the stats coming to back that up. So I would say our sessions are very intense as far as like, you know, they're all out 100%, but we're also getting, you know, full rest. I think the hardest thing that we do, if you ask her, we have a thing called a dynasty, or it's very similar to like a 1080. But what we do is we do like code bounding. So we would do, for example, to on our hop leg, she'd do continuous hops, and she'd be getting pulled like with 10 kilograms on this machine to pull her along, and she just has to keep hopping, hopping, hopping. She said that's harder than triple jumping. So the reason why we kind of do that is it allows her, if you look at kind of this with the parameters, like, you know, the contact times are similar, the horizontal velocities are similar, the distances are similar, so it allows us in kind of a more controlled fashion to get in a lot of contacts that are very similar to doing triple jump. But I think they're really, really intense.
Well, I like that idea because it's actually developing the capacity to be more active on the strike every time at a faster speed, and that presumably transfers very, very quickly.
Yeah, and because if you don't, you're gonna fall on your face. So,
That sounds a bit cruel.
Yeah, I mean that's never happened, but it's like it kind of feels like that because you can never get lazy because it's the you kind of have a lazy contact that thing's still pulling you, so you have to, you know, be very, very active and try to maintain as much speed as possible because that thing's just gonna pull you.
Well, every one of us looking back in our lives thinks, well, what I know now, I wish I'd known then, and I would have done things differently. Anything have you ever had any of these thoughts? What you could have done differently from what you know now, way back 10 years ago?
I think one of the biggest things I actually learned from a technical perspective, I used to believe that you didn't need to have steering ability. So when I'm talking about steering, so there's different research on this and a lot of different things. But like when you're coming to the board, the question is, should you be looking at the board or should you be trying to like actually aim for the board to take off? And so the trade-offs here is like, okay, let's say you don't pay attention to the board at all, then you can just like run full speed, you know, and just, you know, blast the jump, right? If you have to steer, then there's probably some, you know, thinking that you're doing. You take the intensity off a little bit. Maybe your posture is different because you're actually like looking down at the board and stuff like that. So if you really look closely, there's a lot of people that are doing that. So yeah, steering can be bad because if you're literally looking down at the board, your posture is going to be off, probably slowing down, could be taking big steps or whatever. That's not good, right? I think for me, the big kind of change was, you know, in the Tokyo Olympics, Thea had a jump that was over probably like 15:10 or something like that, but it was a foul. And so for me, that was actually gave me a lot of confidence that, wow, she's in great shape, she can do this. But like, you cannot go to a major competition and not be able to get on the board. Like, it's the sport is too, it's like, the penalty is way too high, right? Like the Olympics is a, you know, could be, depending on what country you're from, it could be $1 million day, right? And so, you know, if you just weren't being disciplined and getting on the board, or you didn't make the finals, and you fouled the big jump, nobody cares, it doesn't matter, right? And so for me, I would have probably, you know, if I could go back, I would have practiced that more, but, you know, I'm grateful for the, I guess, the pain of that competition, and because I think right now Thea is really, really good at steering. We have a, you know, a pretty sophisticated checkmark system, and she can like make real time, you know, changes to her approach and still run really fast and still do it with great posture and jump super far. it's possible. I think it's a big skill and it'll take a couple of years to develop, but I don't think we can be a big time jumper and just randomly run down the runway and just hope we're gonna get on the board, especially in the long jump.
Cool, so promise you this is my last one before I open it up. When you agree?
It's 12:45 now.
Yeah, so, where about to do? Oh, yeah. We had an athlete in the British team called Keith Connor. Don't know if you come across Keith?
I know the name.
Yeah, okay. He's not a bad triple jumper. And anyway, we got to the European Championships in 1982, and he dominated, got a gold medal at a time when it was only the Russians, or the Soviet Union, or the German Democratic Republic, or these guys got one triple jump, we didn't. And I said to him afterwards, what's changed, Keith? And he said, well, these other competitions have been going over these last few seasons. I've really been learning competitions because I knew I wasn't as good as these guys, and I knew they knew things that I didn't know. And I used every one of these competitions as preparation for what's happening today. And as you know, you also Olympic medals after that. When we're other elite coaches in this room, preparing an athlete's career, are you aware that some competitions are learning competitions? And afterwards, do you check what's been learned?
Yeah, I think the only time you fail at a competition is if you don't learn something. And so I think, Thea, for example, she's had a lot of losses. She has way more losses than she has won. She's only won one Diamond League meet, for example, in her whole career. But, and so I look at it as like, well, one, there's your periodization as far as your training and what you're trying to peak. We're not trying to peak, generally speaking, for a Diamond League meet, right? And so we're using those meets. I'm not saying we're totally like training through them, but we're using those meets as a way to prepare for world championships, Olympics, or whatever happens to be in that year. And so I had one woman in the long jump. She won 681 this year, had a big PB, which is great. But I told her, hey, like this year's it's an off year, and I want you to really, we're trying to work on her approach and being able to not like over adjust coming to the board and lose all of her speed. And I say, look, all I want you to do, like I don't even actually care if you foul. I just want you to bring all your speed to the board, and you have to like get out of your, like some people, a lot of jumpers I think have a really bad gauge for where the board is. They think the board is there, but they're actually like a foot off, and they need to like recalibrate, break their brain. And so I was just telling her, I was like, look, this year we're just going to work on recalibrating your brain, and I'm not even worried about you trying to jump far. I know you're going to be in good shape, but just focus on this thing. And so you might take, I know something might take a couple of years to do, and so you might have to take a whole year to be a learning year. But I think that's what you have to do if your goal is to be consistent and you want to be able to, be a contender, for the major championships. You can't just randomly do stuff. You don't want to just have a good PB at a random meet. You want to be able to PB like on demand.
Aaron, it's been a fantastic conversation. Any questions for Aaron at this point? Okay, I know we're a bit over time, but we started a little bit late. Thanks so much. It's been a tough day for you traveling to get here. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot. This idea of what is it you're doing where you're trying to adjust for the board? You use
Steering.
Steering. Never heard that word before, so I learned something today.
Awesome.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.